Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Making Sense of Life. Just if you've got a hot drink, just come and sit up at the tables at the front here. Come and join us. If you've just arrived, grab a drink, then come and sit down. Find a seat around a table as far forward as you can, and we'll get underway in 1 minute. To Making Sense of Life here at Carrubbers Christian Centre. My name's David. I'll be leading us through our time together tonight. Carrubbers is a church. It's a Christian community, a community of people just like you, a people of faith. Not the kind of faith like you see in the movies and Indiana Jones, a blind leap of faith into the unknown and the dark, but a people of faith that is seeking understanding, a people who aren't afraid of asking the big questions of life, because we're confident, we believe that the Bible has good answers. Over the course of this year, on these first Sunday nights of the month, we're going to be thinking about trying to make sense of life, asking the big questions about life. Who are we? Where do we come from? What does the good life look like? Where are we going? These are the big questions. And what we want to do each night is think about that question and bring God into the picture, bring God into the equation. You see, as Christians, we believe that we have a creator. He is the source and the giver of life, and we cannot make sense of life here below without factoring in him who reigns above. What you can expect tonight and in future nights is some music. Our house band is going to play for us at different points. We've got Phil on the drums, we've got Stephen singing, we've got James on guitar. They'll be playing for us at different points. There'll be a short interview between myself and a different person each month. Tonight's going to be Kirsten, who's a teacher in Edinburgh. She's going to be joining me in a few minutes. But also a big feature of our evenings is some talking from the front from me, but also significantly talking between yourselves at tables. So I do have 4 tables right down here at the front. All of you who are in rows at the back, you're very welcome to come forward and fill these tables. We're going to have 4 different occasions tonight when we're going to talk about some things at our tables. So that's going to be a big part of our time. So sit down, relax, move to the front, grab a drink, and listen to our first song. It's all about celebrating the fact that we have a maker.
Just going to start by reading a few verses from a book of the Bible called Psalms, which is a collection of songs written by various people to God. This is Psalm 139. O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you know it completely, O Lord. You hem me in, behind and before. You've laid your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. And I have a maker. He formed my heart before even time began. My life was in his hands. He knows my name. He knows my every thought. He sees each tear that falls, and he hears me when I call. I have a Father. He calls me his own, and he'll never leave me, no matter where I go. And he knows my name, he knows my every thought. He sees each tear that falls, and he hears me when I call. Yes, he knows my name, and he knows my every thought. He sees each tear that falls, and he hears me when I call, and he hears me when I call, and he hears me when I call.
Again, thank you very much for joining us tonight and coming out for our first night of trying to make sense of life. Tonight we're thinking about trying to make sense of humanity and what is it that makes human beings worthy of human rights. And to help us just get started, I want to invite up Kirsten, who's going to come and join me. And I think Kirsten's a great story that will help us reflect on these things. Kirsten, you're a teacher. Well done. That's a hard job.
Thank you.
But you don't come from Edinburgh. Where was originally home?
So I am originally from a wee town in Northern Ireland called Antrim. So if anybody knows where that is, about 20 minutes from Belfast.
Well, just say we're from Belfast.
Yeah.
That's it. That'll do. Where did you study before you came here to Edinburgh?
So I did my undergrad up in Aberdeen. Did petroleum geology up there. Had a great 4 years. Would recommend.
And while you were there in Aberdeen, you got involved in a particular ministry, and I wondered if you could tell us a bit about it.
So I became involved in a ministry called Restore, and it was a ministry which involved going into the red light districts in Aberdeen, so within the strip clubs and some of the sort of sex houses, and we would just go and try and support some of the women that were working there. So it would be either just friendship, so trying to just have conversations with them, or also trying to sort of support them with material goods as well. So, if they needed toiletries or clothing or, things like that, we would try and be able to help out with that.
You would have been, 19, 20, 21?
I was, yeah.
What drew you into that? Why did you want to get involved in that area of work?
Good question. And it's one that my poor dad asked me when I went and told him I'd just been into the red light district that night. So whilst at university, I was invited to a film night to view a documentary called Nefarious Merchant of Souls. So I'm not sure if you've maybe heard of it. I would hugely recommend actually watching this. So it's a documentary which highlights modern day slavery, and particularly slavery within the sex trades. And after viewing this documentary, I was just utterly heartbroken. And I really didn't know what to do with this feeling of just rage and injustice. And that was sort of my takeaway feelings. And, I was praying about this and saying, God, why, I've watched this, I've got all these feelings, I really don't know what to do with them. I didn't feel like I was in any sort of a position to be able to, burst in and stop the sex trade in Scotland. And that's when he actually led me to this ministry that was already up and running in church. Managed to get involved with that. So that's probably how I first got into it, yeah.
And it's interesting, there is this drift in our society to want to start talking about it as sex work, but that word you use is so important, sex slavery. Yeah. That's what it is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like the narrative that our society tries to, to feed us is these women have a choice to be here. It's modern day feminism. It's freeing for them. They're taking ownership over their bodies. And that is just the biggest lie. Most of these women that I was involved with had very, very little control over their own lives. The clubs and these gentlemen clubs, as they were called, were operated by pimps. And these women were essentially owned. So they were housed all together in one house in Tory, which is just outside of Aberdeen. Everything about their lives was controlled from when they had to get up, what time they were working, from what time the heating went on in the house. All of their wages were completely controlled as well, so they often didn't have access to their own accounts. And just other factors, like there was a free bar for them as well, so a lot of them sadly developed problems with alcohol, and a lot of actually incurred a lot of debt to these pimps and these club owners. Often as well, these women were moved around, so very often they would spend about 6 weeks in one area, and then were moved in sort of like a circuit scene. So they would start up in Aberdeen, would be moved down to Dundee, and then just moved down the coast all the way into England, and then across into Europe, where they would complete a circuit in Europe and then end up with us about 6 months later back up in Aberdeen. So because of that offered a set of challenges in that we had a very, very short window of time with a lot of these women, and then they would disappear. And that is part of these pimps, control, is that people can't get close to them, and because they are moved so often, it's very, very hard to, figure out their whereabouts, and it almost makes them an even more forgotten part of our society, because you often just don't see them.
So you've only got that period of 5-6 weeks potentially to make a connection with them. We've talked there about the lies, exposing the lies that cover this whole area of society. What, as a Christian, what hope, what truth could you bring into that situation to those dear women?
So when we would arrive in the evenings, we would have a bit of chit-chat on the door with the owner, which in itself was really bizarre, I'll be very honest. And then when we got into the clubs, once the women realised we didn't want to dance, they would say, well, then why are you here? And that's a really valid question. Like, I think it was maybe 19 when I started. Like, what on earth was I doing? Standing in my big coat, talking to these women. But I think they were so used to this transactional relationship. Everything had a price, had a cost, and they weren't used to receiving anything for free. Everybody had a motive that was in there. Everybody was out to serve themselves, and they were so wary of that. So I think being able to just demonstrate to them that we weren't here to get anything for ourselves. Actually, we wanted to come and to serve them was a really, really foreign concept for a lot of them. And actually, a lot of them really struggled with that. They didn't want to be trapped. They didn't want to be, taken advantage of, like more than they already were. And actually, that's where the message that we were there to share with them, that, Jesus doesn't want anything from you. You don't need to work for this. You don't need to sign up and pay for this. He is giving you this gift of free life and eternal life. And I think that was something that they struggled with to understand, but it's what we just kept trying to tell them and show them, week after week.
There's a God in heaven who sees them and loves them and doesn't just want to use them. Maybe as we finish up, Kirsten, are there any stories you can share with us of how you saw God at work in some of those different situations, some of those different people that you met over the years working with Restore?
Yeah, so when I was having to think back just before coming here, I think there's a lot of the women that do really stick with me, and I still to this day, I do wonder where they are. I would love to be able to stand up and share some really, hope-filled story about one particular woman, and I can't quite do that, but I think that in itself has taught me to look for the smaller blessings that are still blessings that God has given us. And when I look back at that ministry, the fact that we were even allowed and almost welcomed into that environment was just a miracle in itself. When I talk about these owners and when I talk about these pimps, they are scary men. And the fact that they let 5 or 6 19, 20, 21-year-old girls just come on in and have free rein to chat to, the women that were working there in itself was a miracle. And they were actually hugely receptive to what we wanted to do. So we never, ever took that for granted, because we knew that they could just change their mind like that and we'd be out and we would never get in again. And I think also just the conversations that we did have a lot, like having the privilege of telling these women that you are so loved, you are noticed, you are remembered, and you aren't as forgotten as society wants you to think, was also a huge privilege. We had that opportunity to pray with them in their place of work at times as well. And so it was looking for those very, very small glimmers of hope, but they were definitely still there.
Well, although you say there, you wonder where some of these women have wound up now. It's an comforting thing, isn't it, as a Christian, to know that there's a God in heaven who sees them, knows where they are, knows their names, loves them, cares for them. And you can continue to pray for them. We all can pray that God would just continue going after these women and they would set them free and restore them to the life and the dignity that they deserve. Well, thanks so much, Kirsten, for coming and sharing with us a bit of your story. Can we give a round of applause? But if you knew Kirsten, you see her around church, but you didn't quite know that part of her story. Don't mess with Kirsten. She's hard as nails. Well, as we continue tonight thinking about making sense of humanity, human dignity, human value, human rights, I wanted to take us to the Bible, to hear what the Bible has to say. We believe as Christians that the Bible is not just a human document, a human book, but it's actually the words of God given to mankind. And I've asked Stephen if he would come and he would read to us a story, a true story from the life of Jesus Christ in one of the Gospels called the Gospel of Mark. He's going to read to us from Mark chapter 5, verse 21 down to verse 42. And this is a true story of Jesus interacting with 2 women. And later on in the evening, we'll get to this story and think more about how it helps us answer our question. Stephen.
When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered round him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue rulers, named Jairus, came there. Seeing Jesus, he fell at his feet and pleaded earnestly with him. "My little girl is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, "If I just touch his clothes, I will be healed." Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some men came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Ignoring what they said, Jesus told the synagogue ruler, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James and John, the brother of James. And when they came to the home of the synagogue ruler, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them all out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him, and they went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately, the girl stood up and walked around. She was 12 years old. At this, they were completely astonished.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, as I look around this room this evening, I can tell immediately that we are all very different. Different genders, different ages, from different nations. I'm sure if we were to spend a bit more time and get to know one another a bit better around the tables, we'd also discover that we have different personalities and different persuasions, different passions. And yet, despite all of those differences, there is not a shadow of a doubt in my mind that in a very real sense, we are all the same. That we are all the same and equal in value and in dignity and in worth. There's no doubt in my mind as I look around and see each one of you that you are a person who has a right to be loved and to be known, to be cared for, and to be enabled to fulfill your potential in life. That you are a possessor of inherent dignity and worth as a member of the human family. Not a question in my mind about that. And so tonight we're asking this question: where do human rights come from? Where does that idea come from that even though we're all so different, we're all the same, that we deserve to be treated the same as bearers of dignity and worth and value? You see, that is not an idea that has always been obvious to people in this world. It is not something that is self-evident. It is something that has had to be fought for across the centuries. You see, we live in a world where, as we've already thought, there are so many differences in aptitude, so many differences in ability. They're so obvious, they're in our face every single day. And that sometimes seems to be more obvious than the fact that we're all the same, that we're all equal. And so there's a tension. There are some people who really are smarter than others, some people who really are prettier than others, stronger than others, can run faster than others. So in what sense can we say that really we are different, but we are the same in value? There's a tension there. I want to tell you two quick stories from the headlines of the last few years that illustrate the tension. First one, I'd like to introduce you to Lord Jonathan Sumption. He was a former Supreme Court judge down in London. And a couple of years ago, he ignited a media firestorm with some comments that he made on the government COVID lockdown policy. He was being interviewed on the BBC Questions programme one Sunday, and he made this remarkable statement. He said, "All lives are not of equal value. The older you are, the less valuable yours is, because there's less of it left." He went on to argue that the lockdowns, they were unfair, because while it was older people who were more susceptible to the virus, it was younger people who were more disadvantaged and hurt by the consequences of lockdown. Lord Sumption didn't do himself any favors whenever a questioner phoned in, and she herself was someone who had spent the best part of a year of her life shielding. She was immunocompromised. And she complained to him, "How dare you say that my life is not of value?" And he just tried to defend himself as a lawyer, and he said, "Well, I didn't say that your life is not of no value, just that it is of less value." And for some reason, that just wasn't enough for this lady. But you hear that, and you can understand why so many people were outraged, why they were offended at this suggestion that some people's lives are more valuable than others. That the younger you are, the healthier you are, the more worth your life is. Keep that in your mind for a minute as I move on and tell you another story. Let me introduce you to Heidi Krauter. This lady was in the headlines this past year when she took the government to court challenging the Abortion Act 1967. Under the terms of the Abortion Act, a woman has the right to request an abortion from her doctor up to 20 weeks, largely for almost any reason. But after that point, there are limitations. And Heidi is someone who has an additional chromosome in her genetic makeup. She has what we know as Down syndrome. And she was complaining that The Abortion Act says that a child in its mother's womb who has Down syndrome or another congenital disability can be terminated all the way up to birth. Any moment up to birth, that child in the mother's womb can be terminated. And Heidi was offended by this. She said, "This law makes me feel that I am not wanted and loved. It makes me feel not valued, that people don't want babies like me." She spoke up for many disabled people who felt discriminated against, stigmatized by the idea that someone can just choose to get rid of them up until birth when they can't do that for other children. Just back in November, Heidi lost her case in the court down in London. The court actually sympathized with her and said, yes, Heidi, you're absolutely entitled to actually feel put out by this, to feel offended by this. It does appear that your life is worth less than other people's, but your feelings are not enough to outweigh a woman's right to choose. And so she lost her case. For our first time around our tables, and there's still 2 tables here if any of you at the back want to come and sit up and sit around and talk together, I want you to think back over what Jonathan Sumption said, what Heidi Crowder says. I want you to think about how do their statements make you feel? And is there one in particular that you feel more drawn to that you agree with, and why? Take 5 minutes at your tables and chat about that. Well, if you wanted to draw your initial discussions to a close, we've set out our stall, two very different clashing opinions between Lord Jonathan Sumption and Heidi Kreuter that takes us really to the heart of what we're thinking about tonight, our topic of the sanctity of human life. You know, it was only back in 1948 that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declared for the first time that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That was just declared in the wake of the Holocaust just years before in the Second World War. Now, it sounds good. I think we would probably all accept it and agree with it. But the question is why? How do we know that that is true? The UDHR doesn't tell us why this is true. It just asserts this as a matter of faith that you should just accept and believe. But why is this the case? You see, this is the dilemma we have as a Western society in these present times. We have these values about the equality, the dignity, the liberty, the sanctity of human life. We believe them to be true, but we don't know why. We don't have the foundations to support these beliefs that are so important to our everyday lives. At the very same time, we live in a world where we are faced by cultures in the majority world where they don't accept these things as being true, especially when it comes to the rights and the equality and the dignity of women. And so this is a very real problem that faces us in the 21st century. The question is, where do our values of human dignity, where do our beliefs in human rights come from? Are they simply things that we have invented in our heads? Or instead, are they things that we have discovered in the fabric of reality? These are two different answers that come from two very different stories that understand this question in two very different ways. I want to look at these two stories. I call them the human rights story and the God story. Very quickly, let's think about the human rights story. Scotland is known as the birthplace of the Enlightenment. Many of its leading thinkers and figures lived and worked here on the street outside the Royal Mile. And the heartbeat to the drive of the Enlightenment was to create a new society with laws and freedoms and rights that didn't depend upon any traditional authority or any kind of religious belief system. The Enlightenment believed that human reason alone, tools of human reason and science, were all that we needed to build such a society. But the problem when you start off like that, when you start off with a secular worldview, when you leave God out of the picture and you think we can work this all out ourselves with what we've got in here, the problem is that secular worldview ends up reducing human beings. Not elevating human beings, but reducing human beings to being merely the products, the mindless products of time, chance, and natural selection. Someone who appreciates the implications of that secular belief system is the atheist professor Noah Yuval Harari. In his best-selling book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humanity, he describes human beings in the first chapter as an animal of no significance. He goes on and explains in chapter 3, most legal systems in the world today are based on a belief in human rights. But what are human rights? Human rights, like God in heaven, are just a story that we've invented. Take a human being, cut him open, look inside, you'll find the heart, the kidneys, neurons, hormones, DNA, but you won't find any rights. The only place that you find rights is in the stories that we have invented and spread. Now, it might not warm your heart what Professor Harari says, but you cannot fault him for his ruthless intellectual consistency. In a world where there is no God, human beings like you and I, we have no greater purpose than survival and reproduction. And in such a world and in such a worldview, you will find it very, 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 very difficult to have foundations to support your beliefs in human dignity and equality and rights. That's not to say we haven't tried. We've spent the best part of 200-300 years as a Western world trying to do this unsuccessfully. Some unsuccessful attempts, let me just take you through them very quickly and simply. Some people have said, well, human beings, they're worthy of human rights and special consideration because they have special characteristics. That unlike the animals, human beings have other things about them that make us special. Particularly the fact that we have rational minds, the ability to communicate. These are capacities that only human beings have, and that makes us special. That makes us worthy of special consideration. But the problem is when you go down that road, is you'll not only end up separating human beings from animals, but you'll also wind up separating some human beings from other human beings. What are you to do about people who are of lower than average intelligence? What do you do with those who are mentally handicapped? Are they not worthy of special consideration and protection and rights? That's the dilemma. Another possibility that the thinkers have tried is that the state gives human beings human rights. People imagine back to the very first societies, whenever people got together to form the first human communities, and they imagined that people before that were free. But they decided to band together, club together, and they surrendered their power to the state, and the state in turn granted them human rights and protections. But the great problem, if you go down that road, is that if a past human government has given us rights, what is to stop a future government deciding to take away the rights of a minority group in our society? And if the majority think that's a great idea, they would actually like to enslave this group over here, well then what's to stop them? The state gives and the state takes away. It's not impossible to imagine. It's what happened in Europe in the last century, in Germany. And then there's a third possibility. That is that just human rights, human values, it's just self-existent. It just exists. That just as there are scientific truths out there in the material world, so increasingly there are thinkers saying that there are these moral truths. Just as there are mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4, it just exists. That's just the way it is. Tough, you don't like it. 2 + 2 = 4, it equals 4 in all universes. It's just a fact. Just as there are truths like that, there are also moral truths. That human beings are valuable because they're valuable, and that's just the way it is. You just have to accept it. Because we can't live unless it's true. We can't live well unless that's a fact. Well, I would actually suggest that we can actually do better than that. I think that what makes far better sense of the fact that we live in a universe of physical laws that makes science possible, the fact that we live in a universe where there are mathematical laws that work and allow us to do science, the fact that we live in a universe of moral laws, things that we know, values and deep convictions that we possess about justice and equality, the fact these laws exist is evidence of there being a divine lawgiver who put them there in the first place. And so that takes us from the human rights story onto the God story. And it might surprise you to discover that the foundation of human rights and human dignity and human equality, it's religious in origin. It has grown up in a particular soil, the soil of Christianity. You don't have to be a Christian to accept that that's true. The secular historian Tom Holland, in his book Dominion, writes that every human being possessed an equal dignity was not remotely self-evident a truth. The origins of this principle lay in the Bible. Even our friend, the atheist professor Noah Yuval Harari, who we mentioned a few minutes ago, he agrees as well. He writes, the liberal belief in the free and sacred nature of each individual is a direct legacy of the traditional Christian belief in free and eternal souls. You might not be a Christian here tonight, but you certainly believe Christian things if you think that people are worthy of value and are equal. That's what you discover when you open up the very first page of the Bible. On the very first page of the Bible, we read, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, after our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the air, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. The Bible here is celebrating that the crowning glory of all of God's creation, it's not the mighty mountains, it's not the stars and the nebulae and the constellations, it's you and me, it's human beings made in the image and likeness of God. People with rational minds and free wills, people with incredible curiosity, with incredible imaginations, everyone with incredible potential. That is the crowning glory of God's masterpiece of creation. human beings. The Bible tells us that we are never just matter. Timeless, mindless matter. And the Bible tells us that we matter because we have a Maker who loves us and values us. So to summarize just what we've thought about so far, Christian thinker Glenn Scrivener writes, the God story and the human rights story are connected. Without a God story and without a very particular God story, he means Christianity, humans remain adrift in the world, fending for themselves and valued for their properties only, some valued more and some much less. What I'd like you to do now in your groups, there's two questions going to come on the screen. First one is, are you surprised to hear and learn this, that the things that you believe about human value and equality, that they actually come from the Bible? Is that a surprise to you? Be honest. And I think this is, I forgot to change the second question, so I'll need to change the second one. The second question is, have you ever thought about how the God story and your story connect? Your origins, your meaning, your destiny. Have you ever thought how the God story and your story connect? I'll change the second one. Over to you for 5 minutes. Again, we want to draw your conversations to a close. I want to particularly just pick up on that thread of thinking about how does the God story connect with your story, our story as human beings. There's no better place, I think, to answer that and to think more about that than to go back to the passage that Stephen read to us earlier from the Bible, from a true story taken from the historical account of the life of Jesus Christ. You see, God has come into this world. God's not just up in heaven. God has come into this world as a human being called Jesus Christ. And when you look at Jesus, you see God in action. And you see, when you read the life of Jesus, you see him interacting with all sorts of people, how he takes marginalized people and makes them the center of his attention, how he treats nobodies as if they're somebody, because they are somebody to him. He touches the untouchables. He defends the powerless. He speaks up for the voiceless. Every single person who Jesus Christ ever met on this earth, he treated with honor and dignity and compassion. And in this story in Mark chapter 5, we meet two women, two very different women at that. One is a 12-year-old girl. She's dying. The other is an older lady who for 12 years has been suffering. She has an incurable illness that has ruined her life and has caused her to be ostracized onto the margins of her community. Now, this child, starting with her, she's the daughter of a VIP in town called Jairus. Jairus is a pretty important figure. And Jairus, at this moment, as the story kicks off, he is rushing with Jesus, trying to get Jesus back to his house as fast as possible. He almost wishes that they invented the blue lights and sirens, because he just wants to get Jesus home as fast as possible because his daughter's dying. And he needs Jesus to do something to save his daughter before it's too late. The problem is that in ancient Israel, the streets are narrow and they're busy. They're packed with people, especially at this time in the day. They're just absolutely packed. And so it's so difficult to squeeze through the crowds to get Jesus from the marketplace to Jairus' house. And there in that busy street, in that crowd, there is the second lady, the lady who has been unwell for 12 years. People feared that they would get sick if she was near them, and so she's been ostracized, pushed out of the community. She lives on the margins. And after 12 years of being rejected by people and suffering, rejected by her family, by her friends, by everybody, she doesn't think very much of herself anymore. She's beat down. She has low self-esteem, what you would say. And she's heard the stories about Jesus, that Jesus does things that no mere man can do, that he is able to make sick people well again. And she desperately wants to be made well again. And so she sees her opportunity. Jesus is passing by. She doesn't think that Jesus would have time for her. Nobody's got time for her. So she just anonymously reaches out quietly her hand in the middle of the busy, packed street and just touches the hem of Jesus' garment. For 12 years, she had seen every doctor that there was available. She had tried every treatment on the market. Nothing worked. In that one moment, touching Jesus' garment, she was healed. In that very same moment, Jesus stopped. Stopped right in his tracks and said, "Who touched me?" If you were in her shoes, what would you be thinking in that moment? You'd be pretty scared, wouldn't you? Think, oh, I've done something wrong. I'm really in trouble now, aren't I? This big guy, he is going to be so angry at me. It's me, Jesus. It was me. I touched your garment. Jesus tells her in the hearing of everyone in town. Doesn't scold her. He says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you." Now, Jesus didn't have to stop and talk to this lady. He did need to be somewhere else at that very moment. But he deliberately stops and makes contact, human contact with this woman, because that's what she's lacked for 12 years. Jesus wants her to know that God in heaven is her heavenly Father and that she is his daughter. And he loves her and cares for her and values her. And far from embarrassing her in the sight of everyone in town by making her step forward and reveal herself, by announcing that she is well, Jesus has actually just made it possible for her to be readmitted into the community. He's removed the social stigma around her. She's now clean. She's now safe. She can be brought back into our friendship and family circles. And so we see in just this little encounter how Jesus sees this woman and treats this woman with incredible dignity and transforms her life physically, socially, spiritually. It's incredible. Again, for a few minutes just at your tables, here's a question to reflect and talk about. To what extent can you see something of your experiences, your own heart of feeling rejected or being disrespected by people? How much do you see something of yourself in your own experiences in this lady and her story? Over to you. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt your conversations again. I think all of us have some experience with rejection, don't we? Or at least, if we haven't faced it outright, we have spent our lives doing everything possible to avoid it. We fear it. This lady knows all about it, and isn't it just amazing to see how Jesus relates to her? And I think that all of us then can see that if that's how Jesus relates to her, we can catch a glimpse of how Jesus sees us and how Jesus wants to relate with us in her story. But meanwhile, don't forget, Jairus is over here. He's watching all this happen, and he's tapping his feet on the ground. If he had a watch, he'd be looking at it going, "Come on, Jesus, we need to get back to my house as soon as possible." Sadly, while all this is happening, one of his employees comes from his house bearing this bad news, saying, "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the rabbi anymore." Just the trapdoor is opened in Jairus' world. He's just collapsed. Absolute worst nightmares come true. He believed that Jesus would be able to help his daughter if only he could get there before she died. But Jesus is about to show Jairus that he can still help after she has died. He reaches out his hand. Jesus touches Jairus and he says, "Don't be afraid. Just believe and she will be healed." And so they head off through the busy streets to Jairus' house. When they arrive, the mourners are all gathered. Jesus asks to be taken upstairs to the little girl's bedroom. They go in and they see her little pale, lifeless, limp body lying on the bed. She's very much dead. But then Jesus goes over and he takes her hand. And it's as if he reaches down into death and lifts her back out again. He says to her, "My child, get up." It's almost like he's just trying to wake up a sleeping teenager. "Come on, wake up, get up, come on." But she's dead. But to Jesus, death is just like sleep. And he is able to raise this little girl back to life. Her heart starts beating again. She gasps for breath. The color returns to her face. She sits up. She's alive. And then Jesus, again, paying attention to the wider needs that she has in her life, says, "Go and bring her something to eat. She'll be hungry. She needs to get her strength back." And so you see in this story, Mark chapter 5, Jesus interacting with these two women, two very different women. And you see the incredible dignity and love and compassion which he shows them. But there is something more that's even far more significant than that going on in this story. Because Mark has chosen these two incidents because he wants to show us that Jesus has just saved these people from the two greatest enemies that afflict the human race, the world over. The two greatest enemies to human welfare and well-being. Their sickness and their death. And Jesus can do something about them. Because Jesus has come to deal with the root problem of which sickness and death are just the symptom. You see, the Bible tells us that God created a good world. He made human beings in his image, in his likeness. That's the way he made the world to be. But the world in which we live today is not the way that God intended it to be, because we, human beings, are not the way that God intended us to be. God gave us the ability to live for him and to enjoy him. But we chose instead to live for ourselves. And rather than result in heaven on earth, it's just unleashed hell on earth. We're like Christmas trees. We've been chopped down. We've been cut off from our roots. We get dressed up now for a while, but we're slowly fading. We're slowly dying. We're losing our needles, our good looks. Never had them in the first place, but some of you. And one day they're going to throw us out in the rubbish heap of history, a place the Bible calls hell. The Bible says that we all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, that although we have been made in the image of God, we have this glorious, glorious status filled with potential. We have not lived up to it. Instead, we have turned our backs on God and descended into sin, disobedience, rebellion against God. And the wages of sin is death. It's the reason why we get sick. It's the reason why we die. But Jesus has come to deal with sin. Through these saving these women, one who's sick, one who's dead, shows that he's come to deal ultimately with sin. He didn't just come to reform human society. He didn't come just to champion human rights. He came to reconcile sinful humanity with God his Father, to reconnect the cut-down Christmas trees with their roots. But for that reconciliation to take place, something has to be done about the sin that's within. Something has to be done with the problem of all the evil and all the selfishness that's within us. And that's what the cross is all about. For God, in the person of his Son, Jesus, takes upon himself the sin and the shame and the guilt and the regrets of all the world. And he suffers for it in our place. He dies for us to make an end of it once and for all, so that we might instead be brought back to God, reconciled with him as our heavenly Father, that we might be reunited with his life that not even death can defeat. It's not just wishful thinking, it's not just positive thinking. Jesus not just died on the cross 3 days later, history records that he rose again from the dead, vindicating his claims that he is the one who can deal with sin, the one who can conquer sickness, the one who can ultimately defeat death and your death. That's the good news that Jesus offers to this world. Jesus shows us through all of these things that in God's eyes, you and I are not just mindless, meaningless matter. No, we matter. We're loved. We're valued in God's sight. And that's good news. For one final time this evening, I'd like you to just turn to those around you and talk about these 2 questions on the screen. And the first one is, what do you think about Jesus from what you've heard from this story tonight? I wonder, are there any other questions that you feel that you need to have answered and figured out to understand fully who Jesus is? Over to you for another 5 minutes. Well, the time is running away from us, and we're going to have to start pulling things towards a conclusion tonight, but don't rush away. There'll still be time to spend talking these things around your tables afterwards. Let me just summarize where we've come to tonight. Tonight we've been thinking about what is it that makes human beings special? What makes it that we are worthy of human rights? And the answer from the Bible is that it's because we're special in God's sight, that He has given us these things as a gift, that He has honored us by becoming one of us in the person of Jesus Christ, His Son, that Jesus has shown us the incredible value that He places upon us in the lengths that He's gone to death and back to save us from our greatest enemies, sin and death and hell. And that God promises us that He loves us and has a plan and a purpose for us, if only we would let Him into our lives. Let Him sit at the steering wheel, give Him the keys, and He will lead us and direct us right through life and help us to make sense of what otherwise often doesn't make sense. Jesus shows us that we are never just meaningless matter. No, Jesus shows us that we matter to God, that we are valued in His sight, we're loved by Him. But that leaves us with, each one of us with a question tonight to go away with and to ponder. The truth is that you matter to God. The question for you is, does Jesus matter to you? Is Jesus included in the picture, your picture, as you seek to make sense of your life? Ponder that a wee bit. The house band are going to come and they're going to perform for us again, singing a song all about Jesus, all about the things He's done for us because He loves us and values us.
From heaven you came, helpless babe, entered our world, your glory veiled, not to be served but to serve, and give your life that we might live. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. There in the garden of tears, my heavy load He chose to bear. His heart with sorrow was torn, yet not my will but yours, He said. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. Come see His hands and His feet, the scars that speak of sacrifice, hands that flung stars into space. To cruel nails surrendered. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King. So let us learn how to serve, and in our lives enthrone Him each other's needs to prefer. For it is Christ we're serving. This is our God, the servant King. He calls us now to follow Him, to bring our lives as a daily offering of worship to the servant King.
Thanks to the house band for serving us so well tonight. Thank you all for coming as we have started our journey of seeking to make sense of life. Don't rush away. There's still time to talk at your tables. Maybe if you've struck up some good conversations at the tables, maybe you want to exchange numbers and you want to go and arrange to meet up for coffee at some point in the next week or two and talk some more, particularly if there are questions that you have about who is Jesus that you would like to explore. Maybe someone at the table who's a Christian could meet up with you and chat with you. If you'd like to investigate a little bit further, there are two opportunities to do so. On Thursday nights happening here, I think 7:30, there's a meal followed by a Bible study going through the Gospel of Mark that we've been looking at tonight. It's a course called Christianity Explored. That's Thursday nights. You can come back here, just show up at the door Thursday, 7:30, and they'll be glad to feed you and to help you find out more about who is Jesus. No food. No food. Controversial. False advertising. Good cake. There's cake. It's worth coming for. Other thing is, we have free copies of this book by my friend Michael Lotz. It's called Making Sense of Life. It's where we've taken the title from and the different titles for each month from. I've got lots of copies of it, and if you would like one, if you're exploring, want to find out more about how to make sense of life with Jesus in the picture, please just come up and see me afterwards. I'd be delighted to put this in your hand for you to take away home to read and think about yourselves. Well, thanks so much for coming. God bless you, and have a great night.